on First at 9 this Wednesday, the 27th of November 2024. Cloudburst. Incessant rains leaves over 230,000 people severely affected across 17 districts. Death toll from the inclement weather increases to 4. Met Department warns existing atmospheric depression will intensify into a cyclone. Policy revision. Central Bank introduces single policy rate mechanism and sets the new overnight policy rate at 8%. Governor confident in the new bond exchange process with the ISB holders. Confidence and commendation. IMF commends government's commitment to reform continuity. Calls on creditors to help expedite Sri Lanka's debt treatment efforts. ADB pledges to support investment opportunities in Sri Lanka amid growing investor confidence.
Chino Dairy, Sri Lankawama Kiren Perata. ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දෙනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟමැති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
කන්ට පරිස්සම් කරගත්තොත් අපි පරිස්සම්.
Asian Paints Causeway Aquasafe වැස්සත් මට්ටුයි ගෙදරත් තිස්නේ.
This is Derana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Derana First at 9. I'm Tharindu Mahendra, joining you live with the latest in Sri Lanka and from around the world. In your top story making headlines tonight, over 230,000 people in 17 districts remain affected as incessant rains along with strong gusty winds continue, prompting heavy flooding and landslides island-wide. Taking the persisting weather patterns into account, the National Building Research Organisation issued evacuation warnings to several areas in 4 districts, urging the residents to evacuate to safer locations. Meanwhile, the Department of Meteorology warns that the prevailing atmospheric depression will intensify into a cyclonic storm in the coming hours. As incessant rains continue to pelt areas across the country, prompting floods, the eastern province continues to remain severely affected. The relief teams of the Tri-Forces are currently working in full swing to provide necessary aid to those affected as the heavy flooding continues, threatening people's lives. Meanwhile, heavy downpours in the Batticaloa and Trincomalee districts further inundated several main roads, disrupting traffic in the areas. A 30-year-old man who was bathing in the river Erupotana in Mahakachikodia in Vaunia amidst the prevailing adverse weather is reported missing. Accordingly, search operations are currently underway to locate the missing person. In a similar incident, the body of one of 6 students who were reported missing after the tractor they were travelling in was caught in floodwaters at Karetiv in the Ampara district last evening was recovered today. The incident had occurred when the tractor, which was carrying a total of 13 individuals including 11 school children, the driver and the assistant toppled due to strong currents in the floodwaters. As adverse weather continued to persist today, measures have been taken to open the sluice gates of many major reservoirs. In addition, flood warnings have also been issued by the Irrigation Department today for several low-lying areas in the Kalani River Basin and Kalaoya Basin. The heavy rains with strong gusty winds also led to the collapse of trees in several areas, disrupting people's livelihoods. Motor traffic in certain areas remains disrupted owing to the trees that have fallen onto several main roads. Further, train services to several areas across the island were cancelled due to the prevailing adverse weather. The Department of Railways announced that the night mail from Colombo Fort to Badulla and the return mail train from Badulla to Colombo Fort tonight have been cancelled. The department also noted that the trains operating along the upcountry and Batticaloa railway lines have been limited due to the prevailing adverse weather conditions. The Disaster Management Centre meanwhile noted that the death toll from the persisting inclement weather has increased to 4. The DMC further announced that 230,743 persons belonging to 66,947 families in 17 districts remain severely affected. Taking the current inclement weather into account, the National Building Research Organisation issued warning level 2 amber warnings to several areas in the Badulla, Kandy, Kegol, Kurunagala and Nuwara districts. In a later development, the NBRO extended the level 3 red landslide early warnings issued to several divisional secretariat divisions in the Kandy, Matale and Nuwara districts, urging the residents of these areas to evacuate to safer locations. Meanwhile, the Department of Meteorology warns that the deep depression over the southwestern area of the Bay of Bengal is likely to move closer to the east coast of Sri Lanka and further intensify into a cyclonic storm during the next 6 hours. Against this backdrop, President Anura Dissanayake has instructed all relevant authorities to provide immediate assistance to those affected by the current adverse weather.
Union Assurance.
Welcome to Cinnamon Life, South Asia's biggest entertainment hub, where awe awaits.
චන්දුරුසුමේ කාගෙන්ම අපේ සිග TV සඳහා සුපිරි ඩීල්.
Sadaharita Plantations Limited, celebrating 22 years of your trust.
Central Bank Governor Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe expressed confidence that the government's decision to issue new bonds to replace expired ones as per agreements reached with international sovereign bondholders will attract sufficient participation. Speaking at the monetary policy briefing today, the CPSL chief stated that the issuance of these bonds will enable Sri Lanka to secure lower interest rates and a haircut while offering greater incentives for bondholders. Additionally, the Monetary Policy Board of the CBSL decided to further ease its monetary policy stance by 50 basis points, setting the newly introduced overnight policy rate at 8%, which will replace the previous dual policy rate mechanism.
With the announcement of moving to single policy interest rate, we will be moving from a dual policy interest rate mechanism to single policy interest rate mechanism, and we call newly introduced single policy rate as overnight policy rate, and that has been now set at 8%, and that will serve as the primary monetary policy tool for signaling and operationalizing monetary policy stance. And we expect to target to maintain the overnight average weighted cold money market rate, which is the operational target of flexible inflation targeting framework, at around the newly announced OPR. And with the introduction of a single policy interest rate, the SDFR and SLFR, which were considered as policy interest rates earlier, will no longer serve as policy interest rates. So SDFR and SLFR will be linked to the OPR with a predetermined margin by the central bank. SLFR will be a plus margin with OPR and SDFR will be with a minus margin with OPR. So yesterday at the Monetary Policy Board, the Monetary Policy Board has decided to further ease the monetary policy stance of the central bank. With this, the overnight policy rate has been set at 8% and statutory reserve ratio remains at unchanged at 2%. So with this change, the effective rate reduction will be around 50 basis points compared with the average weighted cold money rate that was prevailing at the time of moving to the single policy interest rate. Major considerations are deeper than expected inflation in the near term, with further moderation in underlying inflation pressures and inflation expectations, and better than expected developments on the external front, and lack of further space available for reduction in market lending rates.
ජාතන උල්ලාරබුල සමග පවතින ඒ ගිවිසුමේ වැඩපිළිවෙලේ තුන්වෙනි සමාලෝචනය සාර්ථක අවසන්.
Following the successful conclusion of the third review of the IMF program, we have reached a staff-level agreement. After the government presents the budget, we anticipate receiving approval from the IMF Executive Board and the release of the next tranche soon. In addition, we are nearing the conclusion of the restructuring of international sovereign bonds. The government 2 days ago decided to issue new bonds to replace the expired ones. Consequently, the new bonds issuance was launched yesterday with a haircut and a lower interest rate. We expect to finalize this process with the participation of the majority of bondholders within the next 3 weeks. Our projection indicates that the economy will normalize within the coming year. The monetary policy stance has already improved, and we are assured of the continuation of the IMF program. Therefore, we are confident that the economy can be effectively managed, leading a greater financial stability and economic growth in the next year.
මූලික අවශ්‍ය මූලික පියවර රාශියක් දැන් සම්පූර්ණ කරලා යනවා. ඒක යනවා ආර්ථිකය ඉදිරියට කල්පනා කරන හැකි වෙයි කියලා බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා.
උද්දමනය දැන් අවදමන තත්ත්වයකට පත් වෙලා ඉන උද්දමනයක් ඉදිරි කාලයක් තිස්සේ පවතින්න පුළුවන් කියලා. නමුත් ඒ පරාසයටත් වඩා ඉවතට ගිහිල්ලා අඩු වුණාම ඒකත් ගැටලුවක් නේද?
ඔය ඒක නිසා තමයි අපි අර මේ ඒක වැඩ පිළිවෙලක් තමයි උණ මතක ඇති කලින් අරගෙන අපි අර මුල ප්‍රතිපත්තිය ලිහිල් කිරීමේ ක්‍රියාදාමයේ දිගටම ඉන්න ඊට පස්සේ
That is precisely why we have taken steps to address the situation by easing policy rates. This is one of the measures to bring deflation within the target range. The main factors contributing to higher than expected deflation include reduced electricity and fuel prices due to price formulas as well as a stable exchange rate. Core inflation remains at 3 to 4%, while headline inflation is currently below target levels. We expect inflation to align closer to 5% moving forward, and the recent policy decisions are aimed at achieving that. Credit supply has also improved, which we believe will foster economic growth and further support our inflation targets.
උදව් වේ ඉදිරියේදී උද්දමනයේ නැතත් යථා තත්ත්වයට සාමාන්‍ය තත්ත්වයට පත් කර ගැනීම ගන්න ක්‍රියාමාර්ග.
කාලයක් පුරාවටම රින මට්ටමක තියෙන උද්දමනයේ යම්කිසි ආකාරයක අහිතකර බලපෑමක් ඇති වෙන්න පුළුවන් ආර්ථිකයට.
ඒක දීර්ඝකාලීන පවතින නම් අවදමනය ඒක අහිතකර තත්ත්වයක් තමයි.
Yes, if deflation persists for an extended period, it can have adverse effects. However, it is important to note that we are transitioning from a period of hyperinflation. Previously, inflation rates were around 70%, with cost of living at 80 to 90% and food inflation exceeding 100%. I believe the deflation we are experiencing is, to some extent, a correction from the previous period of hyperinflation.
අවදමනයේ තියෙන එක මම හිතන්නේ ඒක අපි දකින්නේ යම්කිසි correction එකක් විදියට.
Do you see this as a start to the end of the easing cycle? Do you feel that there will be a pause?
I think whether this is going to be a end of easing cycle or remain at this level, we have to wait and see in the next review. We will be closely monitoring the response of the economy in terms of inflation expectations, in terms of economic activities, and also the closing the output gap going forward, and also the real interest rates, plus the balance of payment. But we are seeing for the time being, we think this is an appropriate monetary policy stance. But I don't expect kind of the sharp easing that we had from last year this year. I don't expect that kind of trend will continue.
So can you predict a GDP growth for the end of this year and mid next year?
At the end of this year, we already indicated this will be 4.5 to 5% compared to, I think, World Bank or ADB announced 4.4% for this year. For the next year, it's still too early for us to make a firm projection, but we can say the baseline would basically going to be 3%. We are very confident that economy will certainly grow well above 3%.
Yeah, and when you said continuation of the IMF program, what does it mean? Like,
no, continuation means the key parameters under the IMF program, like the primary surplus of 2.3%, the revenue GDP target of around 15%, and the inflation target maintained medium to long-term 5%, and the building of reserves to a much more comfortable level so that our external repayment capacity, carrying capacity would be increased, and also the completion of debt restructuring. Those parameters has been assured to be maintained going forward. So those are the key parameters. Within that, there could be certain here and there changes. Those changes one can see when this is approved by the executive board somewhere in February next year. Our level of reserves right now is gross reserves 6.5 billion. Remember the targets under the IMF program, net internal reserves, we have commitment to build up to this certain level. We are actually building more than what was expected. It's kind of overperformance, building up official reserves. Building reserves continuously on steady basis as well as stable currency and bit of appreciation also in the last couple of weeks. I think going forward also we'll continue to build up, and we want to build more. Actually, this is an important buffer for a country to meet any external debt service or any other obligations.
On the debt exchange, there's a deadline of December 12th. So if some people miss that, or if they don't exchange, what will happen to those like residual bonds?
I think what we hope that is that within this 3-week period, there will be marketing, and we hope that there will be a sufficient participation. There are certain thresholds. We are very positive that all the thresholds will be met. If not, there are options even for us to exchange for the period. That's not an issue.
Do you expect like about 90% take up or 95%?
Bondholders' point of view, it has sufficient incentives for them to participate in terms of exchange fee, in terms of macro-linked bonds that they were asking. A lot of incentives and encouragement for them to participate and get new bonds.
Fast track your career from O levels with eSoft.
ඩයබටිසෝල් සීනි වලින් පරිස්සම් වන ඔබට අමතක නොවන පෝෂණය.
ප්‍රයිම් ගෲප් ලංකාවේ ප්‍රථම වතාවට හඳුන්වා දෙන ලෑන්ඩ් ලීසින් ලේසියෙන් මීටමක්.
Single 1111 up to 60% off from the 11th November to the 17th of November.
Kalani wire කිසිගින්නක් නැහැ.
කිසිගින්නක් නැහැ. Kalani Fire Shield Wire.
Now, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, is of the view that the new Sri Lankan government has reaffirmed its commitment to continuing the country's economic reform agenda. Issuing a statement on Sri Lanka to the financial community today, Georgieva called on creditors to help expedite Sri Lanka's debt treatment efforts, ensuring the success of the country's IMF-supported program. The IMF chief's comments come after the government yesterday decided to proceed with the restructure of approximately $12.55 billion worth of international sovereign bonds. Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, says Sri Lankan authorities have reaffirmed their determination to persevere with the reform agenda and put the country's economy on a path of sustained and high growth. She assured that the IMF remains a steadfast partner in supporting Sri Lanka and its people and stands ready to assist the country in achieving its economic and social reform goals. The IMF Managing Director also highlighted that the continued support from international financial institutions and other official creditors, together with the participation of bondholders in a debt exchange consistent with debt sustainability, is necessary to underpin the success of these reform efforts. Georgieva noted that Sri Lanka's economic reform program, supported by an approximately $3 billion 48-month extended fund facility arrangement that was approved by the IMF's executive board on the 20th of March 2023, has gotten off to a good start, with the economy recovering, inflation remaining low and reserves being accumulated. Following the completion of 2 reviews, Sri Lanka and the IMF reached a staff-level agreement on the 23rd of November this year for the 3rd review under the arrangement. In June 2024, Sri Lanka agreed on a Memorandum of Understanding with the Official Creditors Committee and reached a final agreement with the China Exim Bank on a debt treatment program. Building on this progress and following several months of constructive discussions, Sri Lankan authorities reached similar agreements with both the Steering Committee of the Ad Hoc Group of External Bondholders and the local consortium in Sri Lanka. The IMF chief noted that the terms of these agreements have been assessed by the fund staff as being in line with the parameters of the IMF-supported program. Georgieva is of the view that rapid completion of the debt operation with high creditor participation would be vital in capitalizing on the momentum and ensuring the success of the program. While highlighting that the Sri Lankan authorities continue to finalize remaining debt restructuring agreements, the IMF Managing Director emphasized that this collective effort is key to supporting the success of Sri Lanka's debt restructuring efforts. Meanwhile, Samagi Jana Balawege parliamentarian Dr. Harsha De Silva is of the view that the government's decision to continue with the previous international sovereign debt restructuring agreements must be commended, despite it contradicting their pre-election rhetoric. He expressed confidence that if the current reform program continues, Sri Lanka would be able to achieve a credit rating that would enable the borrowing of loans from the international market once more by 2027. Government has decided to go ahead with the debt restructuring agreement that was agreed upon 2 days before the election without any amendments. This is what should happen. The reality is that debt restructuring must continue without any alterations to the debt sustainability analysis. The only cause for regret is the fact that they failed to grasp this reality prior to the election. In any case, a request has been made for all bondholders to express their concurrence with this process in the coming weeks. The Hamilton Reserve Bank has filed a suit against the Sri Lankan government before a New York court. If they withdraw it and concur with this process, even if 100% of the bondholders do not agree, at least around 80 to 90% of them will, and as such, it could be continued. As of now, approximately 50% of external bondholders and 12% of local bondholders have already expressed their agreement, which means over 60% of all bondholders have agreed to this process. Looking at this as a country, putting aside political biases, it is clearly beneficial for Sri Lanka because the sooner debt restructuring can be completed, the sooner we can emerge from the default status. If this economic program is continued, by 2027 we will have a credible credit rating, enabling us to once again obtain loans from the international market. Whether government would obtain such loans or not, in accordance with their ideology, is beside the point. However, that procedure would be available. The Asian Development Bank has pledged its support for investment opportunities in Sri Lanka, citing increased foreign investor interest fueled by the government's systematic financial reforms. The ADB made this statement during a meeting held at the Presidential Secretariat today. The meeting was led by ADB's Regional Head of Private Sector Development, Takeo Koike, and Senior Additional Secretary to the President, Gianardi Aponso. The ADB delegation highlighted foreign investors' enthusiasm for Sri Lanka's expanding prospects across multiple sectors. The discussion focused on investment prospects in critical areas such as climate change mitigation, agricultural modernization and the energy sector. Both direct investment and public-private partnership opportunities were discussed, underscoring the potential for collaboration in these critical fields and as pathways to further economic growth. Further, the ADB delegation emphasized its commitment to working closely with Sri Lanka to attract sustainable investments that align with the country's development goals. Meanwhile, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce said it welcomes the recently reached staff-level agreement for the third review under the International Monetary Fund's EFF facility program for Sri Lanka. The Chamber issued a statement noting that the agreement underscores the progress Sri Lanka has made in implementing structural reforms and achieving fiscal sustainability during the critical period for economic recovery. It also asserted the importance of continuing the reform momentum and building on the progress made while unlocking key constraints that bind long-term sustainable growth. The Chamber expressed that it looks forward to the government meeting the requirement for the disbursement of the fourth tranche of the EFF by the IMF board. Welcome back. In business news, Treasury bill yields were down across maturities at today's auction, with all 125 billion rupees worth of offered bills being sold. The 3-month bill yield was down 57 basis points at 8.73%, while the 6-month bill yield was down 63 basis points at 8.9%. Meanwhile, the 12-month bill yield was down 70 basis points at 9.08%. All three maturities were offered on tap after the auction. Meanwhile, the Colombo Bourse closed on a positive note today, aided by price gains in counters such as Sampath Bank, Hatton National Bank and Richard Pearis and Company. The all-share price index settled 0.66% higher at 13,049.83 points, while the more liquid S&P SL20 climbed 0.85% to settle at 3,876.61 points. Crossings were witnessed in Ceylon Bank, Hemas Holdings and Ambient Capital. Market turnover crossed 3.6 billion rupees. The banking sector was the top contributor to market turnover, followed by the capital goods sector. Foreign investors closed as net sellers, offloading shares worth 255.9 million rupees. And up next is Ashwini Vikramasuriya from Capital Alliance on our next segment, Economic Outlook.
Sri Lanka's National Consumer Price Index recorded deflation for the second consecutive month, falling to minus 0.7% in October from 0.2% in September. Food inflation increased to 1.3%, while non-food inflation dropped further to minus 2.3%. Core inflation eased to 1.7% in October. Purchasing Managers' Indices showed expansion in both manufacturing and services activities in October. Reserves money increased as commercial banks deposited more funds with the central bank, though market liquidity showed a reduced surplus of Rs 93.3 billion. The Sri Lankan rupee appreciated by 11.3 against the US dollar in 2024 up to November 22nd. However, stock indices saw decline, with the ASPI and S&P SL20 dropping by 1.10% and 2.66% respectively.
And with that, here's a look at the rupee exchange rate for the day. And with that, we wrap up tonight's edition of First at 9. Thank you for joining and have a good night.